A large storm will continue to bring severe weather to the United States over the next few days, bringing the potential for damaging winds, large hail, and a few tornadoes. In addition to this, the tropics are about to wake up in a big way, where our next hurricane is likely in the Atlantic Ocean as we go into the first couple of weeks of September. So in today's forecast, we're going to break down exactly what you need to know about the weather across the lower 48, in addition to the tropics and where a hurricane is likely here in the next few weeks. We are going to begin with what's happening across the United States this morning, which yesterday was pretty crazy. We actually had some big supercells back over in North and South Dakota yesterday. A couple of photogenic tornadoes. If you watched our live stream yesterday, it was pretty crazy. There were multiple tornadoes yesterday in both North and South Dakota, and this is what's left of it from early this morning. Storms rolling into parts of Minnesota. The main threat really after we got off last night was wind and hail. There wasn't really much else left after that, and this is all responsible from this trough that is sitting over Montana, and this is what's going to bring another threat for severe weather today from the Central Plains back into parts of the Midwest, where damaging winds, hail, and more tornadoes will be a possibility. Back down in the southern plains and even the southern tier of the United States, it's actually been pretty active over the last 24 hours. We had some explosive showers and thunderstorms yesterday. We should see a little bit more of that today as well. And then back over in the Ohio Valley, Mid-Atlantic, and Northeast, things for the time being are still relatively dry. Had a few severe storms yesterday, but really nothing too crazy over in those areas. Now let's talk more about the severe weather potential for the next few days, and we'll begin with today, which is tossing trampolines on Tall Trees Thursday. We do currently have a slight risk for severe weather back over in Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin, and then a marginal threat that extends all the way back into Kansas and even into Illinois and Wisconsin. The main concern for today will be damaging winds and hail, but notice there is a 5% tornado risk now in place across Minnesota and Wisconsin. We were talking about this last night on the live stream. We kind of expected this because this is the area that I do think has the greatest concentration and the best chance for tornadoes today. Now, overall, it's still a low threat, but I do expect a few tornadoes. In that case, we will probably be live later today, so make sure that you are subscribed to the channel and click the bell icon so you're notified if and when we do go live. Wouldn't be shocked if we saw an isolated tornado anywhere outside of that area as well, perhaps even central or northern Iowa, or even into western Wisconsin. And as we go into Flying Fences Friday, there is a marginal threat for severe weather for Michigan, Illinois, Missouri, Indiana, Ohio, and Northwest Pennsylvania. Main concern for Friday will just be damaging winds and hail, and it should be very isolated. I don't think Friday will be anything like what we see today. The tornado risk right now, there's not any tornado risk outlined, but I wouldn't be shocked if we did see some sort of brief spin up, maybe in eastern Michigan, and I'll show you why here in just a moment. But today's tornado threat will really be confined, I think, to one area in particular, and that will be back over in parts of Minnesota and as well as Wisconsin. These are the tornado parameter values as we go into the early to mid-afternoon hours. Our main corridor to watch for a more elevated chance for tornadoes will be in central and eastern Minnesota and back into western Wisconsin, where I do think there will at least be a couple of tornadoes this afternoon. And then as we go into the evening hours, there will be a tornado threat up and down from about central Iowa back into western Wisconsin. It should be a pretty isolated threat in nature because a lot of the tornadic activity that we will see will be coming from a line of thunderstorms, which means that we're not going to have discrete supercells like we did yesterday. At least we're not thinking that there's going to be anything like that today. And then as we go into the late evening, we actually could still see an isolated tornado threat exist all the way as far east as areas like Davenport and back into northwest Illinois. It should be a very low threat, but it is something that we'll be watching for as we go later into the evening hours. One of the biggest things that we had yesterday was a very curved hodograph environment, basically meaning that there was a lot of spin throughout the atmosphere from the surface all the way up to the troposphere. We have a somewhat similar setup today, just a hair lower than yesterday when it comes to the hodographs. They are still very curved, especially back up in parts of Minnesota and even back into Iowa. We do have some curved hodographs even back as far southwest as areas like eastern Nebraska. I still think, though, our greatest threat for tornadoes will be back up here in eastern Minnesota and western Wisconsin, and you'll notice those hodographs do remain pretty curved. As we get closer to like 8 to 9 o'clock, though, the tornado threat should be lower, but it's definitely still not going to be zero, as there will still be a chance for an isolated tornado, I think, all the way up until northwestern Illinois. So what's this all look like on the future radar? Well, this morning it's going to be pretty dry. Storms will start to fire up as early as 1 to 2 o'clock this afternoon across parts of Minnesota, even back into parts of Nebraska as well. The main concern with these, I do think, will be damaging winds, and notice by about 2 to 3 o'clock, storms really getting organized just outside of Minneapolis. This is where our greatest threat for damaging winds will be. By 5 to 6 o'clock, this starts to become more of a Boeing segment where embedded tornadoes will be a possibility, and we'll be watching for a wind threat across Wisconsin and even back into Iowa. Now, I think the greatest chance for wind will also be in Minnesota and Wisconsin, but back into Iowa, we could see some isolated to scattered damaging winds and maybe some hail and maybe even a brief tornado. By the time we get closer to 9 to 10 o'clock, these storms continue to move eastbound. The good thing about this is that these storms should eventually become more outflow dominant, meaning that the tornado threat should be pretty low to zero across parts of southwest Wisconsin, northwest Illinois, and eastern Iowa. And then overnight, these storms fall apart as they approach Chicago, so I don't really expect much there. And then our next round of thunderstorms will be as we go into flying fences Friday. Back over in the Central Plains, we'll be watching for storms to develop right in the mid-afternoon hours, and these will quickly move to the south and east. Main concern out of these will just be gusty winds. There could be a little bit of damaging wind potential in Nebraska and maybe a brief tornado, but Kansas should be really close to just being strong thunderstorms rather than severe. And then as we go into early Friday morning, things are falling apart. Now, as we go into Friday, the threat for a tornado will be lower, I think, than Thursday, but I would watch for Michigan for maybe some sort of isolated tornado potential during the mid to late afternoon hours out of the storms that do redevelop in the afternoon. So this is what Friday looks like. Storms will be firing off across Missouri, southern Illinois, and southern Indiana. Those will be your ordinary popcorn thunderstorms with gusty winds and maybe some small hail, but this is where we could see a slightly more organized threat for severe weather just around and just outside of Detroit as we get closer to 5 to 6 o'clock. This should be mostly a wind threat, but I wouldn't rule out some sort of brief spin up before those go into Canada. Beyond Thursday and Friday, that trough will continue to move back up into Canada. This should at least allow for an isolated threat for severe weather on Saturday in the mid-Atlantic. I wouldn't even rule out a couple of isolated severe storms in the southern plains. Once we go into Sunday, we'll be watching for mostly just a drier weather pattern in the northern tier. And then as we go into Monday into Tuesday, things will still continue to be active in Texas and Oklahoma, where some cooler temperatures will also usher in addition to some rain. And then once we go into Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of next week, things do remain pretty quiet for the most part across the United States. The next big storm to watch for will be this particular trough as we go into Thursday into Friday. That could bring some severe weather to the Midwest, but it's very unknown what that'll exactly do at this point. I mentioned earlier in the forecast that the tropics are heating up, and they indeed are. In the main development region, we do have a low chance of development over the next 7 days as that goes towards the Lesser Antilles, and there is a reason why they are heating up. A lot of ensembles are indicating that we could see our next hurricane as early as late next week. And what's really concerning about this is when we look at the ensemble members over the next several days, look at this little area here. That's the tropical wave that we're watching. By Monday, a lot of the ensemble members are now indicating that we could see this as a hurricane back over in the western Atlantic Ocean. And that's by, again, that's only a few days from now. Keep that in mind. Once we go into Tuesday into Wednesday, notice how this really intensifies on the GEFS ensemble members. That is something that's concerning because a lot of these show low pressure numbers, potentially like a Cat 2 or Cat 3 back over in the Caribbean Sea. And then once we go into Friday, Saturday, into Sunday, there is a massive spread of where this potential tropical cyclone would go. Some are indicating that this goes towards Florida. The others are continuing to bring this out to the Atlantic Ocean. And then right behind that, another tropical wave bringing potentially another tropical storm or hurricane to the Atlantic Ocean. Now, obviously, this is just some models that's not guaranteed to happen, but this is definitely something that we're going to have to watch for over the next several days as we are getting closer to the peak of hurricane season. And something like this would not be shocking at this point to develop. We are long due right now for a hurricane in the Atlantic Ocean, and especially in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea. So we have to watch this very closely. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to hit the like button down below and subscribe if you've not already.